Okay, so for you guys, this is your first narrated PowerPoint. I hope it shows up well, hope it goes well. And if you have any questions, refer back to your announcements section on Blackboard, and you can email me anytime. Just put up in the subject line what I told you to put, class and whatever, and that you had a question. Okay, just like if we were in class and you wanted to raise your hand, I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Now, on the second slide, you can see things that we've talked about, most of these. In one form or the other, we talked about all of these. But that's just kind of an overview of how the Roman Republic was falling. And we started back with 133 with Tiberius Gracchus. He became tribune or tribune, and then he was killed, remember, because of land reform. And then his brother in 123, Gaius Gracchus. And remember that together we call them the Gracchi or the Gracchi. I don't know. Again, I don't speak Latin very well. But we've got the social, economic, and political problems, all of these different things going on. And we started that, we kept the marker there with the Gracchi brothers, okay? And so we had mentioned different things happening. We also talked about the Roman army and the power-hungry generals. Basically, what that's saying is you had, remember, those generals who had men loyal to them instead of being loyal to Rome. And you had on on the audio that I did for you guys, had Julius Caesar marching on Rome with his own men, Roman soldiers, but they were loyal to Julius Caesar. So you had some civil wars and some that we didn't talk about and stuff like that. But you're going to have a couple. You're going to have the civil war, of course, between Julius Caesar and then Pompey and the Senate. And then we're getting ready to have another civil war in the Roman Republic here in just a minute. We're going to talk about. So the result of all this and everything that's going on attached to all these is the death of the Republic, which is really going to end in 27 BC is the age of really Augustus begins at that point. The age of the empire begins. So we'll talk about how all that happens. This slide is literally just the chronology. So if you want to look at those, you'll recognize a lot of the things. Again, starting with Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. We didn't really talk about Marius and Sulla, and pretty much everything else we mentioned to some degree or another in the audio, I believe, a great deal of this. But anyway, the things that you need to know for sure, go back and review the audio as far as the date. You need to know the death of Caesar, the assassination of Caesar in 44 BC. You also need to remember to know March 15th is also called the Ides of March. We talked about that in the audio as well. Okay, so literally just look at that because we're going to go into a little bit of detail here about Octavian and who he is and Antony or Mark Antony and Actium. This particular slide is just a good visual. I like to show you maps every once in a while. Maps are so easy to pull up in, on a PowerPoint, in particular on a computer. It's a little bit harder sometimes on the board, say the way our classroom is set up out at the college. Sometimes it's easier to pull up a map, sometimes it's not. But I embedded this map, or I put this map actually as part of the slideshow, because I want you to look and kind of notice where everything is located. Because a lot of times people don't know their geography. They don't really understand when you're talking about certain areas. They have no clue where you actually are referencing. See, this, if you look at it, this is the big picture. This is Europe, okay? Up in the northern part, we have Gaul, okay? Again, close, right there with modern day France today. Look over there in the west, we have Spain, the Pyrenees and the Alps mountains that Hannibal crossed as he was coming down into Italy, the Italian peninsula. Same thing, you had Julius Caesar coming down from Gaul down into the northern part of Italy, okay? And then you notice over a little bit to your east, you've got Macedonia. And as you go further to the south, you realize you have Actium or Actium, and that's marked because that's going to be the great battle. It's marked with a little, battle site symbol there that's up in the legend. Now, you notice in the gray, these are areas that the Romans have dominion over as the Republic is falling apart. Okay, so the Romans have got bunches of North Africa. Remember, the Romans started getting that with the Punic Wars because they were fighting against the Carthaginians over there in North Africa. Remember, between the First and the Second Punic Wars, you had Hannibal's father going over and Hamilcar Barca helping conquer Spain for the Carthaginians. The Romans are going to end up with that. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, and so on. Macedonia had conquered the Greeks. So as the Romans, as they expand out, they're going to end up with the Macedonian Greek territories. And then to the east, you've got some areas over here by the Taurus Mountains and stuff as they were headed further and further east toward the Parthians. And remember, that's where Crassus got killed by King Orodes of the Parthians. So it gives you a little bit of context as to where things are, which I always think is really important. I like maps. I think maps are interesting to me on a lot of levels. But if you can look at it and say, okay, this is what it looked like at that moment, you can see actually the breadth of the Roman Empire as it was about to become, or the Roman Republic as they were still trying to call it at that time. All right, so what's going on here? Well, about a year after Julius Caesar was assassinated, he was assassinated, remember, in 44 BC or BCE on the Ides of March, March 15th, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, so please be sure and know that. But within a year, by 43 BC, we had the second triumvirate formed. And the second triumvirate's made up, again, a group of three men, a ruling group of three men, made up of, first of all, Mark Antony, and a guy named Lepidus, and a guy named Octavian. Okay, now, each one of these guys is going to have something about them that makes them important, just like the very first triumvirate with Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They're each going to play a role. Now, the second triumvirate is going to be just like the first one was. It's going to be this alliance. And politics makes strange bedfellows, right? You're going to a lot of times see people who don't really like each other working together for whatever kind of common goal they might have. So you're going to have three powerful men, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, after Julius Caesar's death. Now, these three are going to be loyal to Julius Caesar, and they want revenge for, his assassination. And they're also trying to figure out a way to keep the Roman, republic actually running. Okay, at least that's the idea. They don't want to admit that the republic is dead yet. Remember it. That's what got Caesar killed to some degree. So you're going to find out that when you have three rulers, just like in the first triumvirate, somebody is going to get jealous of somebody else and so on and so forth. Okay, so you're going to have Mark Antony being a friend of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony is going to have some things, I'm going to tell you about him and some things that he did and so on. Octavian, or I think your book always uses the very Latin Octavius, but his name is actually much longer than that. He was actually Julius Caesar's, I believe it was his great nephew, and Julius Caesar had adopted Octavian as his heir. Okay, so Octavian was a very powerful man. He had Caesar's, blessing after Caesar passed away. And then you've got Lepidus. Okay, Lepidus, he's going to be kind of the Crassus of the group. He's going to be the one that's not nearly as important in some ways. He is a general, okay, so that brings him into the position of being a powerful guy. And he had been, again, a close friend of Julius Caesar, just like Mark Antony, okay. So he was a great commander and whatever, but he's the one who's going to fall from the first, or I'm sorry, from the second triumvirate first, okay. So the three of these guys. Now look at this, okay? They push him out. They push Lepidus out as the same thing, like I said, that happened in the first triumvirate happened, is that you're going to end up seeing the struggle for power, right? So Mark Antony and Lepidus at first, they kind of wanted to take the power for themselves, but they found out that they were going to have to work with Octavian at some point. So we're going to see a big difference in the first and the second triumvirate. If you recall, the first triumvirate between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus was kept a secret. Okay, it was kept a secret until Julius Caesar stood up in front of, I think it was the Council of 500, and he made a proclamation about land reform. Oh, land reform, it keeps getting people killed in ancient Rome. But anyway, Caesar had stood up, and on either side of him, he had Pompey and Crassus. And then the secrecy of the first triumvirate was over. Okay, now the second triumvirate between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus was actually formal. Okay, it was known to everyone. And it was a blatant attempt to take over the powers of the Senate. Okay, the first triumvirate had that goal as well, but this one's going to be quite effective, especially because they're up front from the very beginning. So you're going to see Lepidus becoming a consul at some point, and when Octavian and Mark Antony are going off to fight against the conspirators, particularly Brutus and Cassius, okay, you're going to find that Lepidus would stay at home in Rome, and he would take care of what needed to be done in Rome. Okay, so it turns out that I cut off the recording from that last slide before I was ready to. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about the end of that last slide, because there's a couple things that are really important there. Okay, first of all, we have Mark Antony and Octavian forcing Lepidus out. There were a lot of conflicts among these men, but they were getting worse as time went on. And what they end up doing is they end up pretty much just telling him that he basically is going to go into exile. So they exiled him pretty much. And there were all sorts of dramatic things that happened to Lepidus. If you want to look him up, it's really interesting if you read about Lepidus and some of the things that he dealt with, especially when he was dealing with the second triumvirate. So anyway, let's focus on Mark Antony then and Octavian, who are the ones who are left. Okay, so Mark Antony and Octavian are working together, but there's some drama there too. Underlying everything, we see that Mark Antony was married. He was married to Octavian's sister, okay, Octavia. So Mark Antony heads over to Egypt, which is where all the cool men go, right? Julius Caesar went to Egypt after Pompey's death. So Mark Antony goes over to Egypt, and guess who he meets? Cleopatra. Well, this is not a quick affair. I mean, Mark Antony marries Cleopatra. Now, first, though, he sends a messenger back to Rome and tells his wife that he wants to divorce her. Now, again, a little bit of drama going on underneath all of this, because Octavian and Mark Antony are in a position at that moment where they are fighting each other sort of for control. So, who's going to have control of Rome? Octavian wanted the people of Rome, the Senate, and whatever to distrust Mark Antony. So, guess what he starts to do? He starts to spread a lot of rumors. Now, Octavian's not lying when he talks about Mark Antony cheating on his sister, on Octavian's sister. He's not lying about that. But he does start to spread rumors that Mark Antony is going to end up marrying Cleopatra, or he has already married her, and that not only would he marry her, but he was going to bring Cleopatra to Rome and make her a queen. So, Mark Antony and Octavian, they had tried to work together, but at this point, you've just got you've got some things going on between the two of them that just makes it absolutely ripe for propaganda. Now, you have a guy that I mentioned briefly. You have Octavian, first of all, who, he wasn't crazy about Mark Antony, all this is going on and other stuff. You have Caesarion. Remember that? That was Julius Caesar and Cleopatra's son. Okay, Caesarion. It's Caesarion. Okay, it means Caesar's son. Now, Octavian thought that Mark Antony, as he went over there and was divorcing his wife and marrying, Cleopatra and all this stuff, he started questioning very loudly Cleopatra's influence on Antony, right? So Octavian turned the Senate against Mark Antony. Therefore, instead of Octavian having to go out and actually declare war strictly on Mark Antony, the Senate of Rome declared war on, wait for it, Cleopatra. Okay? So the end of all of this, it comes to a head. This is basically a civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian. But in 31 BC, you're going to have Mark Antony and his fleet and Cleopatra's fleet as well. Okay. You're going to have the idea from Mark Antony to trap Octavian and his fleet in Actium. Okay, this is off the coast of Greece, as you can see by if you want to look back at that map at some point. But Antony's not the greatest, sailor and commander. Remember the Romans, they had decided a long time ago they weren't particularly great at sailing. Well, Antony's in command here. So you have a lot of his officers who have lost some respect for him. Remember how important that is, because if you have a general with an army that is loyal to him, they'll do anything for him. But a lot of Antony's officers thought that Cleopatra was stepping outside of her boundaries by coming in to council meetings, by giving her own opinions. The Romans didn't believe that women should participate in the government of Rome. So this really helped Octavian with his propaganda. And then you have Mark Antony's own men starting to turn against him and questioning whether he is fit to be their leader. Okay, so, this is all falling into place for Octavian. Now, even though Mark Antony came in with a lot more in terms of supplies, a lot more men and so on, they're unable to actually carry out the plan, which, if you recall, the plan was to trap Octavian and his fleet and Cleopatra's fleet at Actium. or Actium. Again, I don't care how you pronounce it, as long as you kind of know what I'm talking about. So in 31 BC, that was the plan. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra have more forces, more troops, but they are not going to be able to pull things together, partially because of the low morale of the men. I'm sorry, my phone went off just then, and I had to see what was going on. I need to put that on silent. Okay. All right. So anyway, Antony and Cleopatra, they're going to fail at trapping Octavian and so on, and they were able to escape. But what happens there is Mark Antony's going to end up in one place, Cleopatra's going to end up in another place, and they were trying to raise more troops. And so Mark Antony actually ends up committing suicide. Now, there's a lot of there's some stories around this. You can look up these things. Some of it's been romanticized, but Mark Antony does commit suicide, and then eventually Cleopatra is going to commit suicide. Okay, either way, I mean that's the ending part of all of that is that both Antony and Cleopatra end up dead. Now there's some very romantic stories, and there's Cleopatra supposedly committing suicide with the poisonous asp, and there's been some things in modern times that said that probably wasn't working, or it wouldn't have worked actually because it would have taken too long. And I don't know, it's just kind of been romanticized to the point where it's really sad because in the middle of all of this love affair that these two are having, you're trying to make them into like a grown-up Romeo and Juliet, and I find that terrible personally. I don't like that sort of thing, but that's my own personal opinion. Now, Antony and Cleopatra, like I said, they were married. It wasn't some short affair, and they had 4 children. Okay, they had 4 children. So, it was a very different thing than Julius Caesar coming over and basically having an affair with the very young at that time, Cleopatra. She's grown up a little bit and so on. Now, Cleopatra, I want you to know too that she was actually Cleopatra the Seventh, okay? VII, Roman numerals. Okay, there was not just one Cleopatra, there's only the big one that we all know of. But that was actually Cleopatra the Seventh. And so you're going to see this story coming up. Julius Caesar wrote a whole play of, Antony and Cleopatra. I love Shakespeare. But again, that led to the whole thing about being, I don't know, the whole thing about being romanticized. But anyway, there's other some romantic stories about them, like Cleopatra was called over to a place over in I don't know, in Turkey today by Mark Antony, and supposedly to catch his attention, she's going to be dressed in a decorated barge with purple sails and stuff, looking like Aphrodite, supposedly. Yeah, Mark Antony supposedly is equating himself with the god Dionysius, who is the Greek god of wine. And, also, um, they're going to have this meeting somehow where forget all of that, whether any of that happened or not. They're going to end up falling in love. They're going to end up, having this relationship. So either way, I mean, Cleopatra and Antony are going to have some twins, and then I know they have one set of twins. I believe it's a boy and a girl, and then you're going to have 2 other children. So keep those 2 other, or the 4 actually together, the 4 children of Cleopatra and Mark Antony in the back of your mind, as well as Cleopatra's older son, Caesarion, with Julius Caesar. Okay, keep them in the back of your mind at some point here. Okay. Now, what's going on here on this particular slide that we're on, that I'm talking over and kind of catching up other stuff, but what's going on this slide is that after the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Mark Antony are dead. Whatever story happens there. Octavian emerges as the leader. Okay. And Octavian knows that the Republic's dead, but he also knows that the Romans don't want to admit that the Republic is gone. He saw what happened to Julius Caesar, and he has to be smart. And Octavian is definitely smart because he figures out how to use these to his advantage. He wants power. So he becomes the leader of the Senate in 28 BC, and then a year later, he is given the title Augustus, okay, Augustus, which means the revered one, okay, a title. This is not a name, okay, Augustus is not his name, it's a title, and this is what he goes by for, the rest of his life. We're not going to hear him called by Octavian, his given name. We're going to hear him called Augustus. Okay. Again, title. Now, he's going to end up becoming the first emperor of the Roman Empire. How does this happen? Well, you're going to see that it's pretty it's pretty easy to trace how it goes because Octavian wants more power. And sometimes when you want more power, you need to act as if you don't want more power. Because sometimes people look at those power hungry men or women and they're like, wow, man, what would happen if he or she got all that power they want? They would be, maybe drunk with power, as Plato would have said, or something. So you kind of want to act humble if you want more power. So Octavian knows this, and he's going to figure out exactly how to make this all come together where he ends up becoming the first emperor of Rome. Okay, so we see that Octavian is going to make, well, he's going to come into Rome, you know, when he comes in, after the Civil War with he and Antony and, the Senate and Cleopatra's troops and all this kind of stuff. Octavian's going to come in and he wants to be in that position where the people believe that he still wants a republic. Okay. He doesn't want the people to think he wants power. So first he's elected as consul. Okay. With another guy. They're going to be co-consuls. And the Republic really needs this stability at the time. They need to have the same old offices. Consul is very comforting to them. Now, Octavian wants to return Rome to a state of stability. So what he does is he kind of steps back. And in 27, he makes a big, really this big dog and pony show, as we would say, of giving full power back to the Roman senators. He says, you know what? I need to step down. I've been serving you for a while, and I think I've got Rome on the right track, and I need to make sure that the Senate continues. So he steps back. But turns out that the Romans don't really want him to step back. Okay. When Octavian had been consul, he had commanded his representatives, and, this was usually some sort of a senator, to kind of look around and make sure that people were doing exactly what he wanted them to do. And he had become this incredibly powerful figure in the city of Rome and also the Roman Republic, which included the colonies and the provinces. But you also see that when he made a big show of acting as if he did not want the power, in January of 27 BC, the Senate gave Octavian the title of Augustus. Okay, now that's from a Latin word. It can mean venerable. It is usually a sign of religious authority, okay, not necessarily political, although that's going to change as Augustus takes on his political leadership and as others take that title later on as political titles. Okay, so you're going to have Augustus getting the title, or Octavian getting the title of Augustus. Sometimes you might hear him called Caesar Augustus. Sometimes you might hear him called Augustus Caesar. But from 27 on, he's no longer going to be called Octavian. He's going to be called by his title. Now, he never uses the word emperor. Okay, he calls himself princeps. This is also a title that was given to him. He also calls himself by that title, princeps, instead of emperor. But we call him emperor. Most historians will say, okay, look, this guy is the one who consolidated power to himself in a way that he is ruling as an emperor, not simply as a consul or anything that was elected. He's controlling and conducting himself as not the princeps, the first citizen, as he called himself, or Augustus, which is even a higher title. He's gone beyond that. So we see very clearly that he was acting as an emperor. So we consider the start of the Roman Empire to be 27 BC. This particular slide is not incredibly important, except that it shows the way Augustus liked to have himself portrayed. So he always wanted himself to be portrayed with a full head of hair, looking like he was in his 30s. And it turned out, he was balding. He lives to a ripe old age. He's not going to pass away until 14 AD. So this is part of his kind of show of strength to the Roman people, that he always looked young. And remember, those people are not going to see him on TV. They're not going to see him in magazines and in whatever. They're going to see him maybe in statues, maybe on the money, right? So even though they knew he was getting older, this was a psychological thing. So on this particular slide, we're talking about, or we're starting to talk about, the Pax Romana. Okay. So Augustus had come in. Augustus had done a lot of good things. He had built a lot of public buildings. He had, he had manipulated his way into power. But once he got the power, he actually did a lot of good. He if you were to maybe objectively look at it from our point of view in the 21st century, it's pretty hard to say, well, that was a good guy, because he was really ruling on his own accord. He was ruling as maybe as a despot, but definitely as an emperor. Okay, but what we see here during the beginning of what we call the Pax Romana, we're going to see that it starts, we measure it, with the end of the Republic, or the beginning of the reign of Augustus. And it goes all the way to the end of Marcus Aurelius' reign in 180 AD. Now, the Pax Romana, it literally means the peace of Rome. So what we're talking about here is the Pax Romana is referring to Romanization of the Western world, the same way you may remember we talked about Hellenization of the world as the Greeks were conquering their territories. They were Hellenizing, or making them more Greek. So the Romans are spreading their culture all throughout their provinces and territories, right? So that includes their legal system, arts and culture and language and tradition and fashion and food, everything. Okay, they're Romanizing the Western world that they've conquered and continue to conquer. Now you have to understand too that when we talk about a time of peace, or you talk about a time when things are going pretty well for most people, that's a time when things that are not immediately necessary to our survival can thrive. Okay? So if you have a time of fairly peaceful, um, say government, not a lot of big social problems that are going on that are threatening your security with your government and so on. If you have enough food to eat, if you have a place to live, our typical food and water, shelter and clothing, and things are okay for you in your culture, that's where you start to do things that are not, as I said, necessary to your survival. Now, arts and culture, to me, I'm like, wow, those things feel like they should be necessary to our survival. But sitting and painting or sculpting or designing fashion, those are not things we see in very poor cultures that are struggling to have enough food, right? So you get what I'm saying. So what's happening in the Pax Romana is we're not saying that Rome is completely at peace during this 200-year period. They are still going to have wars, but they're not going to be on, for the most part, they're not going to be on Roman soil. So you think about that like today. I mean, we could look at the United States at this moment, and we have been fighting wars. I mean, since most of you guys have been born, we've um, we've been fighting wars one place or another most of the entire time I've been alive, I guess, for that matter. But you're going to see that if the war is somewhere else, if it's over there, wherever over there is, like when I was a little kid, Vietnam, that wasn't here, that was over there, right? Remember in the Punic Wars, that was how they got Hannibal to go to Carthage. The Romans invaded Carthage, took the war off their soil, and took it to Hannibal's culture, and then that called his hand. You don't want the war in your land, in your territory, in your provinces, in your, anything to do with your places where your people are trying to have any sort of success in their lives, right? You don't want the soldiers to come through and trample the crops or steal the crops or loot your houses or all the terrible things that could happen during wartime. You want the war to be over there. And what we sometimes forget is over there, there are people that really don't want the war there either. But in the Pax Romana, the foreign wars were still happening, but we didn't see any major successful invasions of Rome. And again, we didn't really have a lot of big problems that required special means to solve them. We're past, the worst of say slave revolts and whatever. So we've established that they're going to have peace in Rome itself by these standards, okay? Foreign wars, but not right here at home, for almost 200 years. That's pretty amazing no matter what. And as I said, the Pax Romana is largely referring to the Romanization of the Western world, right? Rome's going to be just a pillar of what we have based our cultures, our traditions, our legal system, and all of that on. Okay, Rome, and with, of course, the influences that we talked about before, the Greeks, as well as the Judeo Christian influences, which we mentioned way in the beginning as the Hebrews, right? So, what they're doing when they're Romanizing is the Roman cities are going to become models for, all the places they conquer, and you're going to have men that are going to be expected to act Roman and teach the people who lived in those colonies the Roman ways. Remember, that was something that happened long ago too regarding land. Remember when there was free land, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were trying to claim that land for the veterans and so on. Well, it's the same idea. Okay, land is always going to be a problem for the Romans. They built incredible roads. Oh my goodness, we talked about that. I mean, some of these roads, you can continue to walk on pieces of these roads today, thousands of years later. They built aqueducts. This is how they carried water to the cities, which meant that the cities could actually continue to get larger because, we need water, and you didn't have to go great distances to carry water back to where you could use it. Now, again, you're going to see the large public buildings, and Augustus is really going to be a master of building great places for the people to enjoy. So you're going to see the use of concrete for the first time. You're going to see that Augustus really wants the people to be happy. Now, Augustus also during this time, during his reign from 27 BC to 14 AD, when he died at the age of 75, you're going to see that he made some other laws. He had some other priorities that I've mentioned to you before. Okay, he's going to make laws that were meant to bring families together or keep families together. He passed laws or put out their laws against adultery, for example. And remember, the goddess Vesta is going to become very important under Augustus. And if you recall, it was during the reign of Augustus when the Roman poet Virgil was asked to write a great work to show the magnificence of Rome. And this was the Aeneid, which we've already talked about a little bit back when we started with the Roman legends. Okay, so remember, that was something that was written to be a rival to the Iliad, right? It's told from the other point of view, from a Trojan instead of a Greek. Okay, now, you're going to see during the Pax Romana professional civil service, which means like the people who are out there doing what has to be done to take care of the empire, the upkeep, right? The infrastructure. So today, I mean, we have people that go out, public works, that fill in potholes, or I have some weird holes in my backyard. So I've called 2 days in a row the City of Elizabethtown Public Works and talked to a really awesome guy who said that because of the virus, they've only got a certain capacity of workers. But, you know, I'm not calling to bother them. I mean, I had another, it's not another hole that popped up, but something else very weird happened today that I ended up calling them back to let them know that I really need somebody to figure out what's going on in my backyard because I don't want a sinkhole to be busting out. But anyway, I digress. So we have public workers, right? These civil service, they're getting paid to take care of everything that needs to be done in the empire. And that's going to include postal service. It's not going to be like we have today. You can't go and, like I do sometimes, get let's for example, a box of Pokemon cards with the big card and then a bunch, little packs of smaller cards, regular size, and address them and send them to my great nephew out in San Francisco. Okay, it wasn't quite that specific. It was more like King Darius back in the 500s, where you had messengers. And a lot of it had to do with the leaders, messengers going from the leaders to the provincial governors and back, and that type of thing. Sort of like Darius again in the Persian Empire a long time before this. You're going to have, like what I just mentioned with potholes, you're going to have road repairs, you're going to have fire brigades, you're going to have police to some extent. So all of this came about as a result of the peace that was in Rome at that time. On this slide, I'm just setting you up for the Julio-Claudians, okay? It's the first five emperors of Rome, and we have to talk about them as a group, okay? You can't just pull out one of them and stop and say, okay, we're just going to talk about Octavian, and then move on and not talk about the other four that followed him immediately, because all of these guys collectively are called the Julio-Claudians, the first five emperors of Rome. And I'm going to give you some very specific reasons on the next slide. Well, not the next one, but I think the second one after this one. excuse me, some specific reasons why they are called the Julio-Claudians and why we must keep them together as a group. So, right here you've got Octavian, Augustus. He's reigning, as I said, from 27 to 14, then AD. Notice that's where the calendar is going to change. And keep in mind also that when we start with our markers of the Roman Empire, it starts at 27 BC. We've already written that on the board a couple of times in class. The empire goes from 27 BC to approximately 476 AD. So that's a long time. So keep that in mind. Think about that, okay? Think about how long the empire is going to last. And then notice that we've got Tiberius, who reigns until 37, Caligula, who reigns until 41, Claudius till 54, and then Nero, who kills himself in 68. So a lot of times people make this mistake on an exam, and hopefully you won't do this because you'll have your notes, you'll have whatever you've got, because your exams, of course, are going to be all online now. But you've got Nero dying in 68, and sometimes I'll ask a question like, well, who was the last Roman emperor? And people will put Nero sometimes. I'm like, no, because the empire went all the way from 27 BC to approximately 476 AD. So what happened in that other 400 years? Well, the answer is we can't go into all of those emperors because this is not a course on Rome. If you ever get a chance, if you really like history, take a class on Rome, just plain old Roman history, and you can get a little bit deeper. There's even classes that they teach on specifically Augustus. There's a great book I have in my office out at the college called The Age of Augustus. It's a great book that tells, all of the accomplishments and some of the strange things that Augustus did. And you can dig a lot deeper if you're that interested in it. There's all kinds of possibilities. But for our purposes, you need to know 27 BC to 476-ish AD was the Roman Empire. Okay, so keep that in mind. You don't need to memorize all these dates, but you do need to have a sense of where you are. So Nero's going to be the last of the Julio-Claudians. Okay. This slide is another one that I just put in there that you can look at your leisure if you really like family trees, which I kind of do. I kind of like to see how everybody's connected and so on. And there's some interesting connections if you take your time and look at these. But if we were in class, we would talk a little bit more about these because we could point them out and you could maybe ask questions or add some things to it. But on this particular one, just look at the Julio-Claudian dynasty and you see the guys that are important up there at the top, his face, you see Augustus, and then you see Tiberius, and then you go down and you see Gaius, who is Caligula, and then you'll see Claudius over there to the right, and then Nero, and that was just me naming them in order, and you can kind of see how they're all related. Again, if you want to, if you want to take the time to look at that, that's the kind of thing I like because I am a nerd. So, what about the Julio-Claudians? Well, this is a dynasty, which means it's a family, right? And the dynasty is called the Julio-Claudians because of the two families that were supposedly very important patricians in the early days of Rome. Okay, the Julii and the Claudi. Now, again, they're not the only families, but they're some of the most powerful nobles supposedly in the ancient world in Rome, and therefore, it was blood. Remember we talked about the patricians, the upper class, and the plebeians or the plebs or the plebeians, the plebes, or whatever, however you want to pronounce that. We had the upper class and the lower class, you might remember. So the patricians, well, the patricians, if you come from one of those families, it's your name, it's your blood, right? Your birth. Now, there are some ways around that because in ancient Rome and in the Roman Empire in particular that we're talking about right now, A lot of times grown men would adopt grown men as their heirs. We talked about this briefly during class one day. So these guys, these five guys, are related through blood, marriage, and adoption. It depends on who we're talking about. And the founder of the Julio Claudians we credit as Augustus, not Julius Caesar. Augustus actually became a Julian when Caesar adopted him. Okay, remember Augustus at the time was known as Octavian, the great nephew of Julius Caesar. So he was actually adopted into the family because he was the he was from the maternal side of the Caesar family, which means that he became a Julian when Caesar adopted him, and so on. Okay, so we really start the Julian line with Augustus. Now, the five of these have something in common here. Okay, they all say, okay, they say, and I could probably have written on there maintained Republican ideals in parentheses as an illusion, okay, or I could have said, left the people with the illusion that they still had a republic because they didn't, okay? These guys know that. Augustus knew that. And by the time we get to Caligula, the third Roman emperor, we know that the people know they've not got a republic anymore. But there was always this, again, manipulation of the people by saying that the Senate and the upper class, the patricians, they're going to still have a part in government. That was not true. Okay, the emperors, Augustus, he did as he wanted. He didn't listen to the Senate if he didn't want to. And it's going to get worse as we move on down. Some of these emperors are really going to despise the Senate, and Caligula is going to really want to torture the Senate in psychological ways generally. But this illusion of a republic and keeping the Senate and the upper class in power was just that. It was an illusion that all five of these guys perpetuate. Okay. Now, again, we're going to have peace and prosperity, hence the fact that we're in the Pax Romana. And we're going to see that Augustus and Tiberius are going to be the guys that are going to rely more on talking, okay? Diplomacy, trying to figure out a way to not constantly be at war with whoever, okay? So they relied more on diplomacy. And then we're going to see later on it shifts over to the later emperors, and past the Julio Claudians, relying on military force, and they will indeed build up a mighty military. So Augustus dies. As I mentioned in passing, I think he died at age 75, and he lived a long life. But Augustus had, well, he had some plans for who would be his heir, but this wasn't really going to work out the way he thought it would. So he had two grandsons named Gaius and Lucius, and he had adopted them as his heirs. And it turns out that Augustus outlives both of them. Okay. So Augustus is going to, by outliving them, he's going to have to suffer the loss of his grandsons, but he's also kind of left without an heir. Okay. So we see that there's, when it comes down to all of this, we see that there's a lot of strange ways of the Romans. But one thing that Tiberius probably never wanted was to be emperor. Okay. Now, Tiberius had been groomed as a member of the royal family for, most of his life, really. And actually, you know what? It was all of his life, because when Augustus was in power, somewhere around the year 39 or 40 BC, Augustus fell in love with a woman named Livia, and she was pregnant. So, I mean, it's interesting because Augustus is the guy out there making the rules against adultery, the laws against adultery. But Augustus divorces his wife, and she was also pregnant. So, you have his wife, Livia, giving birth to Tiberius. Okay? So, Tiberius is going to be raised as the stepson of Augustus, which I just always think that's a little bit, it's such a weird story. You're divorcing and both of the women are pregnant at the time and whatever. Now, when Tiberius's birth father, okay, Livia's first husband, when his father died, Tiberius was about 9 years old. And so he went to live full time with his mom, Livia, and Augustus. Now, they also were going to be close to the emperor's daughter. Augustus had a daughter named Julia, okay? And she was a little bit younger than Tiberius. And they took part in ceremonies and victories and all sorts of things that royal families do, okay? So Tiberius was raised in this environment. Now, the problem is, you want to make sure you do have an heir to your throne. So the boys, okay, all three of the boys that could possibly become emperor were taught very specifically military skills and diplomacy and all these kinds of things. And Tiberius, though, he, as I said, he probably didn't want to be emperor, but he knew that at least he was going to have a big role to play in the government. Okay. I mean, he became a general, he became a well known, important general, and he actually became, a guy who served in the government of Rome. So, he didn't want to be in this position, but as fate would have it. Now, we also know that a lot of times in the ancient world and all the way up through, in some places, modern times, but in medieval times, definitely, they still had many arranged marriages, right? So in the upper classes, that was kind of the way it was. You didn't fall in love and get married back then at this time. Well, Tiberius, though, did happen to fall in love. He fell in love, if you look back when you get a chance, if you want to kind of look at that family tree a little bit, but you can see Tiberius's marriage to Vipsania. I can't ever say her name correctly. Vipsania was truly a marriage of love. Okay. He loved his wife, and it turns out that he was forced by Augustus to divorce his wife, who he loved, and marry Augustus' daughter, Julia. I sigh because, Julia, she had had a couple of husbands before, and she did not treat Tiberius very well. Okay. Tiberius was forced to marry her. Okay. Forced to divorce the woman that he actually loved. Now, Tiberius and his wife Vipsania had a son named Drusus. Okay. So keep him in mind too. Drusus is coming back. So when they got married, Tiberius and Julia were not very old. I mean, he was 30, which is not old at all today, by today's standards at all. She was 27, and she had given birth to quite a few children, about, I think, 5 children, and all of them didn't survive. But anyway, you're going to see that Julia goes out and is definitely committing adultery. he was very angry. He was sad because, as I said, you've got Augustus requiring adultery to be treated as a crime. So now you have Tiberius in a really bad position. Hey, Augustus, you forced me to marry your daughter, and she's cheating on me. So what do I do? Well, I mean, Augustus loved his daughter. So Tiberius, it is said, went back to Vipsania at one point, his first wife that he loved. So he went back at one point and he asked her to take him back, and she pretty much said no. You know, you made your choice. But anyway, he found that she had been remarried because Augustus had ordered her to be remarried. And there's stories that Tiberius was so incredibly heartbroken that he followed her around just crying. So Augustus was so angry at that. I mean, he was not happy to have what he considered to be a weak man who would follow a woman around because he was so sad that he couldn't be with her. You know, Augustus was a human, so he did feel compassion for Tiberius, we think, and he kept trying to make Tiberius happy. You know, he gave him more power, he gave him more, um, more titles. But Tiberius is a guy who really wanted to be left alone. He was extraordinarily depressed. And by the time he was in his mid 30s, he just did not want to be in Rome. So he left, left and put himself in exile. And when he left, he knew that he couldn't just come back to Rome. He was going to have to ask permission of Augustus, who, for a very long time, would not allow him to come back. Now, what happened here? I mean, this is crazy. But Livia, remember, that's Tiberius's mom, if you're keeping score, okay? Augustus' wife. Tiberius is her son that she was pregnant with when she married Augustus. But anyway, she was able to find out that Julia really had cheated on Tiberius, and not just a little bit, a lot. Okay? Now, the thing about this is, under his law, not only was the husband supposed to divorce the wife, but the wife was supposed to be executed if she committed adultery. He couldn't do that. That was his daughter. Okay, he just could not do that. So things get really nasty. I mentioned that he had the two grandchildren, the two little boys, Lucius and Gaius. Okay, and as I said, he outlived both of them. Okay, Lucius is going to die in about 2 BC, and about that time, Augustus calls for Tiberius because he knows that Tiberius is going to be the next one who probably will have to be adopted, right? Now, Gaius, the other grandson, was killed in a war in 4 CE or AD. And so now Tiberius is absolutely next in line because, with the help of Livia, or Livilla rather, Tiberius's mom, Augustus adopted him as the heir. I mean, Augustus was getting older, and even though he really couldn't stand Tiberius, he had to do what was best for Rome. Okay. So, looking at this slide, Again, I've got some more things that I said. I didn't just go strictly by the slides. A good example of taking notes there. And the good thing about having it on video is you can go back and listen again. If you need to take notes, you can do that at your own leisure, whenever you can, however long it takes you or whatever. But anyway, um, Tiberius was adopted and so on. Now, once Tiberius was adopted as Augustus' son and heir, he then was required in turn to adopt his nephew Germanicus. Okay. Now, Germanicus was the son of another Drusus. Ugh, again, the web of people that are involved in the Julio Claudians, man, the web on that family tree is crazy. Okay. So don't spend too much time trying to figure out how everybody's related. That's not always that important. If it is, I'll tell you. Okay. So you need to know, for example, that Tiberius is the stepson of Augustus and the reason he was adopted, and the little boys that are the young, grandchildren that died and all that kind of stuff. Now Germanicus, though, okay, who's Germanicus? His nephew. How's that his nephew? Well, Germanicus was the son of Tiberius's actually half brother. You remember when I said Augustus divorced his wife, his other wife, because he fell in love with Tiberius's mom, Livilla? Well, Tiberius's mom was pregnant with him when they got married, and Augustus' ex-wife was pregnant with Drusus at the same time that Augustus and Livilla are getting married. So these two are actually, wait, would that make them, wouldn't that make them stepbrothers? Let me think about that for a minute, because they didn't have this. Yeah, they're stepbrothers. Okay, so his brother Drusus is his heir, or his nephew, rather, the son of his brother Drusus is his heir. Sorry, that last slide was a long one. That was 14 minutes. Sorry about that. Let's see if we can go through these a little bit more quickly. Okay, so one thing I want you to know about Tiberius is, out of the four that came after Augustus, Tiberius may have been the smartest one. Okay, he may have been. Before he became emperor, remember, he was a general and he was given a lot of titles by Augustus. The problem is he just wasn't all that likable. Okay, remember, Augustus manipulated the people by acting as if he didn't want power, and people were quick to like Augustus. He had that personality, he had charisma. Tiberius didn't. Okay. So instead of being kind and, kind of, yeah, I use the word conciliatory like Augustus had done, Tiberius can't get the people to listen to him by being quiet and soft spoken and nice and kind and gentle in many ways, like Augustus. So Tiberius is the guy that's going to have to raise his voice, okay, literally and figuratively, because if they're not going to listen to him without his cruel and perhaps tyrannical methods, then, you know, he's going to lose control of this empire. So when he became emperor, he's going to be a guy that not only rules, to use a cliche, with an iron fist, he's very, very quick to put people to death if they go against him, but he also does things in his personal life that show he is not going to put up with anyone not listening to him. Okay, he's very, very demanding. Okay. So poor Tiberius had a rough life in many ways, as far as emotionally, especially. But he had gotten really tired once he became emperor upon the death of Augustus in 14. He was getting tired of this, okay? So, and this is 14 AD. But By 22, I mean, he had already started sharing some authority with his son. He was traveling longer every year, and in the year 23 AD, you're going to see that Drusus died. Now, turns out that Drusus, remember, was the son, if you can keep up with all of these different, like I said, web of family tree, but Drusus was the son of Tiberius and try it again, Vipsania. Gee, his first wife, okay, the one that he really loved. This is his son, Drusus, that he really loved, with the wife that, had already remarried because Augustus ordered her to, et cetera, et cetera. So Tiberius was just heartbroken when his son died. Now, around the year 26, Tiberius just said, okay, I am not going back to Rome, I quit. Now, he didn't really quit being emperor, but he pretty much exiled himself again, and he went to the island of Capri this time. Turns out there's a guy named Sejanus who had been a trusted member of Tiberius's inner circle. He had worked for the family for a long time when he became the Praetorian prefect. Now, first of all, Praetorian is a special type of military in this case. These are kind of like the guards for the emperor. Okay, these are very special, high-ranking officials in the Roman Empire at that point. Okay, so you need to know that this guy Sejanus has the utter, pretty much, trust of Tiberius. Well, Tiberius was not a young man when he had become emperor, or they would still call it the Principate, princeps instead of emperor, but we know that's not what was really going on. So it turns out that this guy Sejanus really wanted control of the empire, and he was glad that Tiberius had taken off and that he had gone off to the island of Capri, because that left Sejanus in charge. So it turns out that he really can't be trusted. Okay. Now, some people say that Tiberius didn't really love his son that much, but a lot of sources say that he really did, because that was his connection with his wife, right? The one that he actually married for love. But anyway, we do know that Tiberius went into this deeper, deeper, deeper depression. So, again, Sejanus had taken over, and Tiberius was what we call a figurehead, right? If we were in class, I would have asked you a lot of these questions just in passing to see if I could get you guys to answer out. But, answer to yourself here for a second. Hey, what is a figurehead? Well, a figurehead is someone who has a fancy title, but not the power that goes with it. So Tiberius is the leader, the emperor, the princeps, whatever you want to call him. He was the leader only in name, because Sejanus has taken over, right? While Tiberius is over there in Capri doing, again, a lot of terrible things. Now, what we see here is that it eventually comes to light that Sejanus had killed Drusus, so he would continue to be able to have the power. So you're going to find that Tiberius, once he finds that Sejanus had done a couple things. First of all, he had seduced the wife of his son, okay, and she and Sejanus, okay, his daughter-in-law and one of his close friends, had murdered, we believe poisoned, Drusus, okay. Now, there's some question about that. There's always a question about those type of things. Remember with Alexander the Great, and there's always some questions, but we think that's probably what happened. So this is when he actually stayed after the death of his son. He actually just stayed at the island of Capri and never returned to Rome. Okay. So there's a lot of legends about what Tiberius was doing over there on the island. And we know that some of the things were just absolutely horrific. So on this slide, when I just basically say we have to distinguish the way he treated his enemies and the way he ruled the empire and all this kind of stuff, that was where I had this that part kind of repeats what I'd said earlier about he didn't have the charisma of Augustus, so he was very severe. And while he was on Capri, though, this is where we have some of the most horrific things happening. This is where you're going to have Tiberius having women brought to him, and after he was done, having sex with them, using them whatever ways he wanted to. Sorry, I'm dragging my phone on the table. That sounded really terrible. But he would have them thrown off a cliff. I've had a student before who had gone over and taken a tour of that island, and they actually would show the tour. The tour guide would take them up there and show them the cliff where Tiberius would have the women thrown to their deaths after he was done with them. So I mean, he's dark, reclusive, depressed, and it just gets worse and worse. And at some point, Tiberius has, kind of woken up in some ways, right? So he's gonna he's not claiming himself to be an emperor. Remember, they're not using that term quite yet, but he ended up um, realizing that Sejanus was not a good guy. He ended up actually not trusting him. Now, one of the things that had happened was that Sejanus, it came out, probably did the actual, the seducing of Drusus' wife and the, poison and all of that kind of stuff. So at this point, there's a story that we're not really sure if this happened or not, but the story goes that Tiberius had called for a great celebration to talk about how wonderful Sejanus was doing in his absence and all this type of thing. And at that point, he was up, maybe it's what we would think of as kind of a podium or something. And he was talking about Sejanus and what a great leader he had been. And then, supposedly, Tiberius took a dark turn in his speech and he said, "So imagine my surprise when I realized that you killed my son." Okay, so anyway, what happens is Tiberius is going to have a letter sent to the Senate saying that Sejanus is now an enemy of the state and he needs to be executed. So Sejanus tried to run away, but they were able to take care of that justice pretty immediately. Now Tiberius, for the last few years of his life, so many of the things he does are just terrible. Okay, first of all, he's going to have the women that he's throwing off the cliff. Second of all, we think he may have actually, and there's no other way to say it, may have actually been a pedophile. He would have children there, and there's all kinds of horrible stories. Okay, so at this point, we don't know exactly everything that happened, but we know that he goes through some horrible killing of several people. Okay, he's gonna go through sort of a time period where he wants to get rid of everybody who may actually have had a choice or a chance rather to stop the murder of his son or to stop anything else that really bothered him. Okay. He's hit this low point in his life. And he doesn't really have a successor to the throne. Okay. So finally, he's going to end up picking a boy named Gaius. That's a very, very popular name at the time, as you may have guessed. I mean, we've talked about several people named Gaius in Rome, but this one is a young boy that is actually known by a name that his father's friends in the Roman legions in the military had given him when he was a little guy. Okay? This young man named Gaius was known as Caligula. Okay? He hated that. It meant little boots. Okay? So we'll talk about that in a second. But Tiberius is going to adopt Caligula, and there's all sorts of other things that went on. I mean, you're going to see the reign of terrible things that Tiberius did affecting Caligula, as Tiberius had Caligula's mother and I believe older brother and some of his family had them killed. And so when Caligula was called to the island of Capri to become the heir to the throne, he must have been terrified considering what was going on. And you're going to find that Tiberius really doesn't mind the fact that Caligula is sort of a sadist himself. Okay, he's probably even going to learn from Tiberius. Now, what we think may have happened to Tiberius, we think maybe that Caligula killed him. Okay, we're not sure if that's actually 100% true, but there's definitely rumors that Caligula smothered Tiberius in his sleep. So we don't know. What we do know is that because he was the heir, he became the next emperor of Rome, the third emperor of Rome. Okay, so with Tiberius's heirs pretty much gone and his mental health, rapidly declined. Tiberius is going to die in 37 AD, regardless of how he passed away. He had no successor, and so we have Caligula. Remember, that means baby boots or little boots. It's a nickname for the young man named Gaius. So Caligula is going to be chosen by the Senate, and then they really liked that idea. The people liked it, the senators, everybody was pretty happy with him. He was young, he was handsome, and they thought he was going to be great. He was also the son of Germanicus. Remember Germanicus, the war hero, the guy that when Caligula was a little guy, a little kid, his mom had made him an army uniform to fit him when he was a little bitty boy. And she would bring him out to visit his father as the Roman legions, the troops, were doing their drills and so on. And his uniform that his mom had made for him was so complete that it actually had the shoes just like what his father and the soldiers wore. So anyway, the nickname Caligula stuck with him, but he reportedly hated that name. And at some point, he supposedly would have you executed if you said that in front of him. So anyway, beware. So there's a lot of hope at first, and then something happens. Now, sometime maybe 18 months in, we find that Caligula has some sort of a problem, and he starts to act very differently in some ways. Now, it's interesting because he does you know, good things at the beginning, what happened? Well, the thing is, we don't know exactly what happened to him. As some people say, he already was, you know, crazy or whatever they wanted to call him. But it seems that something happened to him physically. So when young Gaius becomes emperor, he is just a young man. He's about, I believe he's 25, about the same time that Alexander the Great, um, well, he was actually 20 when he took command of Philip II's armies. Hannibal was 25 when he marched on Rome. Heck, Napoleon was a general. So Caligula was about that age when he became really what was the emperor of Rome, right? So Caligula is, again, he's dealing with a world where Tiberius had killed his mother, and he had banished Caligula's mother and his brothers, and then Caligula and his sisters at some point were sort of prisoners. I mean, Tiberius didn't let them come and go freely. So Caligula is actually going to live on the island of Capri, watching how his uncle did whatever he wanted. Remember the horrible things that we mentioned. He's got a front row seat to all of that. So Caligula always said that he had always planned to kill Tiberius, because of his mother and his brother, who had actually been put in prison, and they ended up dying in prison and all kinds of stuff. But he said in his story that he went in to kill Tiberius, but instead he threw the dagger on the floor. Now the story was Tiberius knew about it, but he didn't do anything about it. So who knows? I mean, we have the different Roman historians having different sources, let's just say that way. So Caligula's mom and his brother, also named Drusus, there's many of those, but his brother and his mom both died in prison and so on during Tiberius's big reign of terror. So Caligula, once he became joint heir, he was going to inherit the what we call the Principate. Remember, they don't call it the empire. So Caligula was the first emperor who seemed to be loved by the people. And mostly that was because, first of all, Tiberius had been brutal, okay? And second of all, everyone loved Germanicus. Germanicus was, again, a war hero. He was very famous, and people thought that the first few months under Caligula, when they talked about it, they just couldn't understand what was wrong with him after that. Because some of the good things he did, I mean, he continued in the right and the route of Augustus when he went out and he built more public buildings, and he's going to try to do some taxation that is going to actually help other people, maybe people who needed money. There's always been the poor, right? So he's going to make some of the taxes earmarked to help the poor. He's going to get rid of some of the taxes. He's going to raise the pay of the Praetorian Guard and the military. He's got a lot of things that he really does well in the first however many months of his reign. Now, the problem is that Caligula is extraordinarily paranoid, okay? And he is going to have a lot of other people put to death after he fell sick and recovered, because he believed that he had been poisoned in the year 37. That's what he thought had happened to him. Now, what we don't know exactly, as I said before, is what did happen to him. But we do know that he started to kill people and exile people that were a threat to him. And you're going to see that a lot of people said he turned into a completely different person, and they blamed encephalitis, some sort of illness that caused his brain to swell and whatever, that resulted in. Some people are going to say that he was indeed poisoned. Some people are going to say that he had another, I don't know, well, many different maladies actually I've read about. There was one that I read made a pretty good case for Caligula having thyroid problems, okay, like an overactive thyroid, because they describe him as having bulging eyes and maybe a goiter in his neck, and he would walk through the palace at night screaming at the sun because the sun wouldn't come up. So those are not exactly what your regular person's going to do. But he had started out on a really good note, right? And the people, the rank and file people and the rank and file military, they really like this guy. Okay? He's going to build a lot of places. He's going to build amphitheaters. He loves to have the people entertained. Okay? Now he's the one that in the year 39, he is going to do something that would be pretty interesting for us even to watch today. He's going to order a temporary floating bridge. Okay. So he's going to have all these ships lined up, and they're going to be stretching for over, 2 to maybe 2.5 miles. Now, what he was talking about here, what he was trying to do was Caligula couldn't swim, right? And so he built this bridge, again, temporary floating bridge with ships. He built this bridge basically to show that King Xerxes, you remember Xerxes, his crossing of the Hellespont as he was heading over from the Persian Empire. He had built a similar bridge, and supposedly this was so much bigger. Okay, now he had a horse that we're going to mention again, his favorite horse, Incitatus. He rode this horse across, and he was wearing the breastplate supposedly of Alexander the Great. Now, there was a kind of a prophecy by one of these guys that Tiberius had to kind of soothe him, right? And they would make prophecies. Well, one of Tiberius's guys said something to the effect of, Tiberius, don't worry, Caligula is not ever going to become emperor. He has no more chance of being emperor than he has of riding a horse against this bay. The Bay of Baiae was what it was. So Caligula also is defying that too, as well as proving his dominance. Okay, so again, okay. Now, he really doesn't like the Senate. He is always doing something to either embarrass them or sometimes physically put them in other, uncomfortable situations, maybe torture, but also he's going to have several senators actually put to death. Now, you're going to have Caligula basically treating the senators worse than you would treat, you know, I can't even think, worse than you would treat an animal. He's going to want the senators to realize that they are absolutely under his control, under his will. So he's going to have a lot of infamous things he does. One of the things was that did he really believe he was a god? Well, he said, basically, hey, I don't want to wait until I'm dead for you to call me a god. Call me a god now. I'm a god now. Worship me now. Okay. Did he nominate his horse Incitatus for consul? Probably not. I have a little, like Snopes, I have a possibly down there, possibly, partially true. What we do know is that he hated the Senate. So I personally have always had the idea that he was doing so much of so much of what he was doing just to annoy the senators, besides the fact that he was torturing and killing some of them. But one of those things I can imagine is that Ensitatus, the horse, really got under their skin. Okay. Because when he would have state dinners, his horse would be eating at the table with the senators. His horse had two servants or slaves that were waiting on him. So imagine you're sitting there at a state dinner, you're a senator in the Roman Empire, okay? And you look across the table and there's a horse right there, or maybe right beside you. So Caligula treated his horse very well. And what I imagine happening is, instead of actually nominating his horse for consul, I imagine him being at one of those state dinners and having the horse there, having the senators there, and maybe hearing them talk about becoming consul, which remembers the highest elected office in the Roman Republic, and they're still holding on to that, pretending like it has any power at this point. But anyway, he probably heard them talking about wanting to be consul or something like that. And he probably spouted off, well, my horse would make a better consul than the lot of you. Because remember, he thought the senators were just, beneath him. So that's my own personal thing that I think probably happened as far as some of these things go. He also was known for having an incestuous relationship with his sister, and there's not a lot of things written about that. There's a little bit written about this particularly, um, you know, taboo thing that he does. But supposedly he had fallen in love with one of his sisters, and she's going to die young, and there were stories that maybe he had gotten her pregnant, and maybe um, he had actually gotten so angry with her for becoming pregnant that he tried to rip the baby out of her womb. Some people said that he thought the baby would be so great because it was a product of he and his sister, that he wanted the baby right then. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different things, so many different things. Um, but what's going to happen is he's going to go into mourning when his sister dies, and he's going to make Rome actually mourn for a time. Now, there's also stories that there was a brothel in the palace where he prostituted, his sisters to other men. There were the three sisters. Now, there's only one that you're going to really need to pay attention to as far as her name, and that's going to be Agrippina. Okay, Agrippina the Younger, Agrippina. Okay, Agrippina the Younger is going to be the one that's going to be important in a little bit also. Okay, so again, what happened? We don't always know. We don't always know. I mean, there was a story that one time he had at one of his public games, that he had the guards just go out there and throw a whole bunch of the audience into the arena to be eaten by wild beasts. There were no more prisoners, there were no slaves, there was no one to throw in there. Hey, just go get some of the spectators. So yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting, what he's doing. So anyway, he's going to um, not be the same person, definitely at some point, as they thought he was. So having Caligula reign for a short time shows the perils of having a crazy person in charge. Okay, whatever caused him to turn out to be the way he was. there was nothing they could do about it. They couldn't vote him out, whatever. So they're going to have to assassinate him. So he is going to be assassinated. He is going to be assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. Remember, the ones that are specifically the best of the best. They're the guards of the emperor. So he was coming in, I think he was coming back from the Palatine Games, and they're going to attack him and they're going to kill him. Now, the Roman people were kind of torn, okay, because who's going to be the next emperor? And, Caligula was jumped, just like you had his, sorry, again with that. Sorry, I've got dogs in here, you guys, and I've got all this other stuff going on. I really miss being in the classroom with you guys. But anyway, he was going to be attacked, let's say, in a way that was similar to Julius Caesar himself. He's going to be, stabbed by these guys, and he had a few guys that were loyal to him, but by the time they got there, he's already dead. Now you're going to see that in the, I don't know, the aftermath of all of that, after the assassination, the assassins really want to make this complete. And so they go and they find his wife, Caesonia, and they kill her. And they also kill their, I believe it was a 2-year-old daughter, by smashing her head either against the concrete steps or against a concrete wall. Okay. So we're not really sure why they did that, but it turned out that they were also looking to go kill Caligula's uncle, Claudius. Okay. Now remember, Claudius was the younger brother of Germanicus. Okay. That would be Caligula's father, Germanicus. And they're going to find Claudius. He had been hiding. Okay. He had been hiding, and he wasn't hiding all that well. He was hiding behind a curtain. And they, some of the people who actually supported the family took him and put him under their support, right? Now, Claudius is going to have a very interesting um, term as emperor, or whatever they want to call themselves at the time. He's going to have an interesting term because he's going to be remembered for some things that are really quite unfair. Because when Claudius becomes the leader, he's going to provide a really peaceful moment between the insanity of Caligula and even Tiberius. And then after Claudius, you're going to have Nero, who certainly has his own issues, right? So, anyway, you're going to have Claudius becoming emperor, and he's the first one who is going to be proclaimed emperor by the army, by the Praetorian Guard. So let's address Claudius briefly. And I do mean briefly with Claudius. Claudius is a pretty decent guy in many ways. He was the first one proclaimed by the army, as I said, and they had found Claudius, and they'd taken him off, and they knew he was the brother of Germanicus. So did they have the right to name him as the emperor or the leader? No. The Praetorian Guard, the military, they didn't have the right, but they took the right. And so if nobody stops you, hey, you take the right to do something, or you take the initiative and you do it, then it's done. So he became the next emperor. Now Claudius is usually given, again, not very much credit, not nearly as much as most of us believe he deserves. He's represented a lot of times as being weak, not very smart. Now we know he stuttered, and we know he had a club foot, which means he had a limp, but we know that neither of those two things has anything to do with your intelligence. We know that today. They weren't quite so sure of that back in the ancient world. But as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, I mean, he's going to give a break between Tiberius and Caligula, and then, again, Nero. And he's actually, besides Augustus, he is the least, I don't want to keep using the word crazy, he is the least troublesome. That's a very nice way to put that. Of the Julio Claudians, besides Augustus. Okay, he's the least besides Augustus. And he's also going to be the first Roman emperor who was born outside of the Italian peninsula. I want you to remember Claudius, especially for his public works. Okay, remember we're still in the Pax Romana. We're actually just getting started with it, really, because it goes until 180. Remember AD. But Claudius is going to follow the example of Augustus and others, even Caligula, the whole thing about public utility, public works, things that are for the people. Now his is more, again, the word utility has the same root as utilitarian. So his are in many ways much more practical, right? Where you're going to have, say, Caligula out there building amphitheaters where people could be entertained. You've got Claudius building things like aqueducts, which are going to carry water in from a distance. Now, I've read longer distances, but the Claudian aqueduct supposedly is able to bring water to the city from at least 45 miles away. And again, I've read larger numbers as to how far those aqueducts could carry the water. And today, thousands of years later, you've still got parts of the aqueducts standing. I have on that picture right there on that slide, I have a picture of some ruins of some of the Claudian aqueducts. Now, he also is responsible for building the Portus Romanus down at the mouth of the Tiber, so it would be easier for the Egyptian ships to come, and it would make the trade easier between Rome and Egypt. Okay, so now we meet Nero. Okay. Now, in 54, after Claudius dies, again, not getting nearly the credit he deserves, but there's a lot of drama going on here too. Okay, let me first tell you a little bit about Nero, and then we'll get a little bit deeper here. So, Nero was a descendant of Augustus, and he's going to be proclaimed by the Praetorians, and then the Senate will accept him. He's young, and the people, just like they did with Caligula, they're like, yay, okay, this is going to be a great guy. Just like the other Julio Claudians, he pretty much lied to the people and told the Senate he wouldn't interfere with their powers. Meanwhile, yes, he would. Okay, he's ruling as an emperor. Okay, so a lot of things had happened that got him to the position where he became emperor. Okay, first of all, his name is not Nero. Okay, his name is actually Lucius, and he was actually the son of Agrippina, one of Caligula's sisters, the one I told you would be the one that was important. Okay, he was the son of Agrippina. Now, Agrippina, Caligula's sister, okay, is going to, and if we were in class, I would ask you again, this is one of those questions I would ask you, what's the relationship? But Agrippina, being Caligula's sister, is going to have seduced Claudius and got him to marry her. Now, I would say, okay, so think about it. What's their relationship? Well, he's her uncle, okay? So she seduces Claudius, who's an old man at the time. She marries him, and, things happen, so on and so forth. And she is able to convince Claudius to adopt her son Lucius as his heir. Now, the thing is, Agrippina wanted a lot of power, and Claudius was clearly not going to allow her to have much power. So we think that she poisoned Claudius with mushrooms after he had agreed to adopt her son as heir. And again, the Senate's pretty happy, the people are pretty happy. There's going to be rumors that say that she killed Claudius, but it's not like today. You can't, bring out your forensics and prove it really easily. So the first 5 years of Nero's reign are known as the Quinquennium Neronis. You have no reason to even ever worry about how to spell that. But notice the Quin. This is going to be the first 5 years. And he's going to do a lot of great things for the Romans. His accomplishments in some ways mirror some of the accomplishments of Caligula. Okay, he's going to reduce taxes for one thing, and he's going to ban capital punishment. Nero forbids contests involving bloodshed. Okay, and he does love the arts. Now, the problem with this is that he loves the arts, but he thinks he is a great artist. And by artist, I mean performer. He thinks he can sing and dance and act. And, well, you're going to hear in just a minute that the people didn't really agree with him about his talent. So he was able to maintain some stability during his first 5 years, okay? But after the first 5 years, things are going to start to go downhill pretty quickly. So, after those 5 years, we call this Nero's tyranny. So, there were rumors that, again, were probably true, that his mom, Agrippina, had poisoned Claudius, her uncle, husband, whatever. Okay. And again, that's going to really bother him because he doesn't want to be seen as an illegitimate leader. Now, Nero was only 17 when he became emperor. And again, he really liked to perform. And by that, I mean, he would put on like a one-man show, and he would invite people to come. Now, when he invited you, it didn't mean, hey, I would like for you to attend. It meant you're going to come to my show. Big problem is that his shows lasted hours. And there's stories, the Roman historian Suetonius and another Roman historian, I think it's Tacitus, they tell stories of men pretending to be dead so they could be carried out of Nero's terrible show. You have women giving birth in the middle of his show because they weren't allowed to leave. Okay, so that was a strange thing about Nero. And in July of 64, he's going to deal with a great crisis called the Great Fire of Rome. Now, the real thing that's happening here probably is that he wanted some land to build something, and he couldn't get that land. The Senate was giving him a hard time. Okay, so we believe it's quite possible, if not probable, that Nero is going to set fire to Rome himself. Okay, set fire to Rome himself so he could claim that land and do what he wanted with it. So again, he was the youngest emperor, the youngest sole emperor, for a very long time in Rome. And you're going to see that he has a lot of, not only things like the really terrible performances that he requires you to have and so on, but he has a lot of problems with his mother. Now, it's not just the whole thing about the rumors that she poisoned Claudius and therefore he became emperor. He's just really angry at his mom because she tries to control him. Okay, so you're going to see Nero actually trying to kill his mom. Okay. Now, the first time he tries to kill his mom, and again, there's all kinds of different ideas about why he's going to actually attempt and actually eventually she is going to be killed, you know. But he has this, you know, we have a feeling that he had gotten tired of her telling him what to do, like I said, and he wanted to be his own man. So he's grown up a little bit, right? So there's going to be an affair that Nero has, and his mother doesn't like it, and she's going to be angry at him about it. So he's going to get really angry to the point of deciding to have someone arrange, after he and his mom had been watching some games. You know, they were watching, like, on a beach, I think, some games, and someone, you know, that he knew had been hired to rig the ship that she was going to go back to her residence on, where once it got out to a certain point where she could not swim, it would be too far out at sea to swim, that it would start to sink. Well, turned out that she survived and she was mad. She swam to shore, and man, let me tell you, she was furious at that time. Okay. So, again, you're going to see that the guy who had been set up to arrange for her to die in a way that looked accidental just killed her. Okay. Again, she was extraordinarily angry. He killed her, and then he said it was a suicide. So, you know, Nero basically did succeed, of course, in killing his mother. So, the Great Fire of Rome, back to that for a second. You're going to have a saying that people used to, every once in a while, I still hear it, but not very often. But every once in a while, this was a saying that people used to have. Back, I don't know, I've heard it in old movies and old radio shows and in old books and stuff. But there's a saying, Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned, or Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, he didn't, first of all, because, first of all, there's no such thing as the fiddle or the violin at that time. And second of all, he had done what he was supposed to do. Okay, he came to Rome. He was out of Rome when the fire actually started, which doesn't mean that he wasn't responsible for it, right? You know, just like he was responsible for his mother's death, even though, right? So you're going to see that he comes back to Rome and he tries to help, right? He's going to have a lot of shelters set up for the homeless, the ones whose homes have burned, and he's even going to deliver supplies. I mean, he's going to have food delivered so the people won't starve. So people came up with this idea that he was fiddling while Rome burned. Where in the world are they going to get that idea? Well, you're going to see that, first of all, he was a performer. And so one of the historians, I can't remember which one it was, I think it may have been Suetonius, who said that while the city of Rome was burning, Nero retired up to the highest part of the palace where he could look out on the city. And he started singing a song about the burning of Troy. Okay? So that's where that kind of comes from. Okay? Whoever started that, don't know for sure, but we do know that at least some of the historians will report that he did go up there and actually sing. And Again, it's not like he didn't do anything to stop the fire. He actually did what an emperor should do to stop the fire. Now, the last thing here is the persecution of Christians. Now, Christianity is a brand new religion at that time. It's not more than what 30ish years old. And so he is going to accuse Christians of starting the fire. That's according to one of the other historians. And what we see here is that Christians were arrested and executed by being, as they, this used to also be a very famous thing that you would hear as sort of a bit of common knowledge, that Nero threw Christians to the lions. Okay, so the historians from that time, and I think this was probably Tacitus who had written about Nero accusing the Christians to, remove any blame from himself, but also the fact that he was sending them to the lions, literally, and sometimes having them crucified and sometimes having them burned alive. So if you look at Caligula and you look at Nero, my goodness, okay, who's the worst of those two? It's kind of a hard call for me. Well, Nero's going to end up committing suicide in 68 because he starts to get really paranoid. Now, the truth is, he had good reason to be paranoid, okay? He has really good reason because there is legitimate conspiracy forming to get rid of him, to assassinate him. So you've got Nero supposedly wandering around the palace one night, and a lot of his men have abandoned him. And you're going to hear Nero crying out, is there no one here? Is there no one still loyal to me? Basically whining because, he's kind of a terrible person. But that's my own editorial. So he woke up, they say, really late, middle of the night at some point, and no one's there. So he's sending for people and nobody comes to him. And he goes to where they are and he sees that literally they have all left the palace. Even his friends have left the palace. Okay. So finally he calls for someone to come and help kill him. Okay. Just anybody who can help me die. So he cried out supposedly something like, "Is there no one who will help me? Have I neither friend nor foe?" Again, he's whining. So what happens is he actually goes and he hides for a while, and he's in disguise because he knows that the conspiracy is afoot and they're out to get him. So he has a few guys that have remained loyal to him. Okay, just about maybe I think 4 different guys that remained loyal to him. And he told them to dig a grave for him. Now at this point, he was being hunted, and he was the first thing that the people who were going to catch him had planned to do, or the people who were sent out to catch him by the Senate, was they were going to beat him to death, with a blunt object, as that comes up so many times in our class. And they wanted this to be made public. They wanted to do it in a public place. So Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudian family, and a lot of the senators were kind of a little bit nervous about having the last of the Julio-Claudians killed in such a brutal manner. So Nero knows none of this. He doesn't know anything about this. And finally, he decides he's going to kill himself before they actually find him to kill him. Now, he tells one of his 4 loyal men, he says, "Okay, how about you go first, and after you kill yourself, I'll do it." Oh my gosh, this guy is such a wuss. I'm sorry. Again, I'm editorializing. Nero just gets on my nerves so much. But anyway, Nero um, is going to try to kill himself, but he can't. So instead, he made one of his other loyal men kill him. Now, when the Senate's men, when the men who were sent out there to get him, to bring him back, when they came, they saw that he was dying. Okay. But they weren't able to save him. You know, why would they save him anyway? They were just going to kill him. And the answer to that is really they could have saved him so they could have brought him back and made a mockery of his death. But some historians say that maybe he didn't kill himself, maybe he did. But I've always believed that the story of where he had one of his loyal men actually kill him sounds a lot more like something he would do. So after Nero's death in 68, first of all, he's the last of the Julio Claudian emperors, but the empire goes on, okay? And second of all, you're going to have the year of four emperors where you're going to see emperors overthrowing each other. And it was a time of unsettling anarchy in Rome. So, what else is going on? Well, we've got the rise of Christianity. On that one slide, I just kind of have an outline of the important things that are happening. And we're going to talk about the religious world of the Roman Empire just a little bit. The Jewish background, origins of Christianity, and all of this. This is all going to come up in one form or another as we go through. And the reason we talk about Christianity in this class so much is that when we get to the Middle Ages, when we get to medieval times, which is the period that comes right after the fall of the Roman Empire, you're going to see that the Roman Catholic Church is going to be the most important institution, entity. It's going to be the wealthiest, the most influential in the Western world, okay? And the Roman Catholic Church is going to be in charge during the Middle Ages, and we're going to see how the church is going to be able to save certain things, and certain things, are going to be lost during that time period. And first, we have to figure out, though, what's going on. Why do we have the Roman Catholic Church coming up in the first place? Well, that all comes back to this new religion at the time called Christianity. So, into the world of Rome comes Christianity. Okay, so first, let's look at the backdrop here of the Romans and their religion. Now, remember, the Romans are polytheistic, and they don't believe in an omniscient or omnipotent God. Okay. Their gods are anthropomorphic, meaning they have human characteristics, and they have a very practical attitude toward religion. If you do what the gods want you to do, then they'll probably treat you well. If you don't, well, you're in trouble. So it wasn't really a spiritual experience, it was more of a contract. And the Romans are scavengers. They're going to take things from all kinds of different cultures. And their religion in particular is based on a mixture of all sorts of things, from the Greeks as well as Mesopotamians and or Egyptians, and all sorts of others that they're going to kind of put together into their own particular brand of religion. And I'm just going to take a minute to remember that, remind you that we've talked about Vestal virgins before. Rhea Silvia, the mother of Romulus and Remus, who was impregnated by the god Mars, she was a Vestal virgin, if you recall. But this is a very important position chosen. The women are chosen only from the upper class families. Remember, 30-year service, 10 years as a newbie or a novice, 10 years serving as a priestess, and then the last 10 years teaching the novices. It's extremely prestigious in Rome, and it was such a very, very powerful position that if a man who was sentenced to death saw a Vestal virgin, that was a sign that he was innocent, and he was immediately freed. Now, as I just said, the Romans were scavengers. They borrowed things from everywhere. They borrowed really liberally from the Greeks. But the Romans believe in both a household religion and a civic religion, okay? So you're going to have probably some gods that you worship that may be your particular god or goddess that you believe protects your house, or you ask them to protect your house. But that everyone needs to go and worship the gods, just like the Greeks. Because if you don't go worship the gods, then the gods might remove their protection from Rome. So that was really important. It's the same thing that you saw in the ancient world quite frequently. Now the Romans had this well-developed sense of animism. Okay, animism. Don't think animal, think animation. Okay, something that gives life. Right? You're animated. You're moving. You're alive. So this is a belief that a divine presence, God or a God, exist in every space, activity, and being. There's a God of the hearth and a God of trees and a God of rocks. So today, if we extrapolated that out, would there be a God of iPhones? Would there be a God of backpacks? Would there be a God of water bottles? I don't know. But that was the idea that everywhere there is a God, there's a presence. Now, the Roman gods, again, mostly borrowed from the Greeks or stolen, or however you want to say that, but they didn't have the well developed personalities and mythologies of the Greek gods because, you know, they sort of took the ideas that the Greeks already had. The Greeks were the ones that wrote out those extraordinarily complex stories where all of the Greek gods and all of their legends can connect. It's like a universe, remember? We talked about that. Well, the Romans just said, yeah, okay, we like the Greek gods, let's take them. Let's just give them different names. Because they weren't as particularly interested in the details of their gods' lives. This just provides you with a brief look at some of the gods borrowed from the Greeks. I mean, you have, if you're talking about the Olympians, you could go further and you could go to the Titans and so on, but let's just stick with the basics, the Olympian gods, just a few of these. You had Zeus in Greek, he was the god of heavens. And in Rome, the Latinized name, he became Jupiter. Okay, you had Hera, the wife, the poor long suffering wife of Zeus, because he had affairs with other goddesses and female, humans and everything else. But Hera was the goddess of women. She became Juno. Okay. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, became in Rome, in Latin, she became Venus. Okay. I think that most people know Aphrodite and Venus. I think they both, they've heard of those names. It almost seems almost as as common for someone to know Aphrodite as to know Venus as the goddess of love. But it's very much less common from what I can ascertain. It's less common for people to know Jupiter, for example, than it is for them to know Zeus. Okay. So sometimes that happens. They're usually the Greek gods had so much of that detail that it's easier to remember them sometimes. Okay, so you had the Greek god Dionysius, who is the god of wine, and you would get, you would get drunk. You would drink wine, and that was one of the closest things that the Greeks and Romans would sort of say would be a spiritual experience, because you lost your inhibitions and you were getting closer to the god Dionysius, who became Bacchus in Rome by drinking, wine. Now, Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, we remember him from King Minos praying to him, and, the white bull and all that kind of stuff. Well, he becomes Neptune in the Roman pantheon. And then we have the Hades, well, the underworld god. Hades, sometimes when you think of Hades, people think of hell. They think that the word Hades is synonymous with hell. And yeah, not really. I mean, you have the Greek god Hades, who was actually just the god of the underworld, which did not have that implication of a a place of fire and brimstone and forever eternal torture and all of the things, that we think of as hell, right? The Roman counterpart is going to be Pluto. And some of the representations of Pluto in particular are kind of scary. I think that some of those representations are partially what led us to what's almost become a caricature of Satan, of the devil in the Judeo-Christian world, because Pluto and Hades, you had some certain things about them that were transferred over into the description of the god of the underworld, or later on, this would be not a god, but it would be a created being in the Judeo-Christian religion or religions, a created being by God who ended up rebelling and becoming the evil one. Okay. But some of that, the way he's represented goes back to Pluto. Okay. So the rise of Christianity. Jesus was probably born during the reign of Octavian, by that time Augustus, sometime between 6 and 4, 6 BC and 4 AD, or BCE and CE. And we know that the mystery cults had they had sort of been like what we call foreshadowing, or something that had sort of helped pave the way for Christianity, because the mystery cults, there were cults like to Isis or whatever, that would say that they had certain knowledge that would allow you to obtain immortality. You just had to join them, and they would give you some kind of an initiation, and so on. So this is something that you're going to see in a way in Christianity, because they're going to see that the Christians are going to say, well, if you join us, we know how to achieve immortality. Now, what is Christianity? It's a monotheistic religion that came from Judaism. Okay, one God, monotheism, that came from Judaism, ancient religion. So Christianity, as I said before, through the Roman Catholic Church, the first and the traditional church that originated in Rome, um, is going to come to dominate everything from the time of the Roman Empire all the way up through the Middle Ages. So some of the early appeal of Christianity is that it allows women to participate. Some of the old Roman and Greek religions were very specific, men only, or maybe women had their own religions, or their religious groups or whatever. But in Christianity, you heard that men and women and slave and master, that all were loved by Jesus. Okay. So St. Paul is the one who's really going to have the hand in spreading the religion just far and wide. And St. Paul is also the guy who wrote many of the 27 of the New Testament books. Okay, a lot of them are letters. Some of them he didn't write. Some of the ones that are attributed to him, we don't believe he wrote, but he did write quite a few of the New Testament books. Okay, if you're anyone who is even thinking about majoring in history, first of all, you're awesome. But if you're thinking about majoring in history, there's a book you're going to need to be familiar with at some point, and that's called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written by Edward Gibbon in, I want to say, the 1800s. I'm not sure. It may have been a little bit earlier, but this is a massive book, massive book. And what he says that really had played the biggest role in the decline and then the ultimate fall of the Roman Empire was the loss of civic virtue. People were not nearly as interested in Rome, feeling ownership as part of Rome. They were starting to lose that, as we would say, patriotic feeling. Okay. So they didn't even want to join the army anymore. We don't want to protect Rome. Why do we want to protect Rome? So they started hiring mercenaries. Now, out on the edges, the fringes of the Roman Empire, you've got these tribes, many tribes. We're going to spend the next couple of chapters talking about these tribes in one form or another. But these tribes, if you lump them all together, we call those the Germanic tribes. And many of these Germanic tribes were hired to protect the borders of Rome because the Roman citizens, the men, didn't really want to serve in the military anymore. So what they say, what Gibbon says rather, in his thesis here is that Christianity caused these things. Now, why would he say that? Well, he says, okay, here's what happened. Okay, everybody knew that it was their responsibility to go and worship the gods of Rome because the gods of Rome might withdraw their protection. So here we have this new group of people. First of all, they were thought to just be a bunch of Jews that were kind of doing some strange things, okay? Because really, that's kind of what it was. Because remember, the earliest Christians were Jews. So the Jews had been given a pass. They did not have to participate in the civic religion of Rome because the Jews were such an ancient religion that and there also weren't that many of them. And the Romans had said, if the Jews don't participate, that's okay. We're not going to bother the Jews. But then we started to see groups of Jews worshiping Jesus, okay, and saying that he was the Son of God and that he was God, and all of this stuff came up. And as Christianity started to grow, you're going to find that Roman citizens, Gibbon says, decide, well, if those Christians are not coming to worship the gods of Rome, why do I have to? Okay, remember, they've lost their patriotism. They don't care enough about Rome to protect the borders. Why do we have to go and worship at the civic religious place? Why do we have to go to the shrines? Why do we have to do this? Christians are getting a pass. So that was one reason that the Christians got in so much trouble and so on during this period of time, is because they refused to accept the Roman gods. Now, the Romans, for their part, the Romans were very practical, right? They're not all artistic and so on like the Greeks. The Romans are very practical. These are men of the soil, if you recall. These are farmers at heart. The Romans are like, all right, look, you guys, if you have a new god, tell us. We will worship him too. And the Christians said, no, we're not worshiping him in addition to other gods. We are only worshiping him. So that was part of the problem, or that was, one of the biggest problems that the Christians are going to have at that particular. Now, as we wrap up the last two slides in the Roman Empire, you're going to see that what I'm going to say on these two slides is going to be repeated many times. Okay, these are important things. You need to know the date 476 AD or CE, because this is considered the official fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and we're going to talk about in the bridge PowerPoint that I'm going to put up for you as soon as possible. The one that kind of goes between chapter 4 and chapter 6, because we skipped chapter 5. I'm giving you just a PowerPoint to be responsible for that will be up again as soon as I can get it up. But 476 AD or CE, very important, because this is what we consider the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And see, we're going to talk about on the bridge, how the Roman Empire separated into two parts and why and so on. So the last Roman emperor is actually Romulus Augustus, or Romulus Augustulus. is going to be overthrown by one of the German leaders named Odoacer, which is considered to be the official end of the Roman Empire in the West because now you have one of the Germans on the throne of Rome. So we're at the last slide here for the Roman Empire. And again, yeah, we're going to repeat this stuff again. But the division of the empire is going to eventually come into East and West. And each one of them thought they were the real Roman Empire. Now, the Western Roman Empire is eventually going to decline and fall, as Edward Gibbon says, completely fall apart. The government's going to be gone. It's going to be, really anarchy. It's going to devolve. It's going to go into a dark age, actually, the European Dark Ages, right here during the 5th and 6th centuries. Okay. Now, over in the East, we're going to have the Eastern Roman Empire eventually becoming known as the Byzantine Empire. And they're going to break from the Catholic Church at some point. We'll talk about that a little bit. And they're going to keep a lot of the traditions, though, the Greek and Roman legal, cultural traditions, and some of the other markers that the Greeks and the Romans had, along with some of the elements of Christianity that are going to be over there in the East until 1453. That's a very important year. You need to know that year. That's going to come up, during this. It's going to come up during the 100 Years' War. It's, all sorts of things. But it's going to last. I mean, if you look at that, the Roman Empire in the West falls in 476 AD, more or less. The Eastern Roman Empire does not fall until almost exactly 1,000 years after that, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, that's the end of that. Look for the PowerPoint that's going to be for Chapter 5. Do not even worry about reading Chapter 5 unless you just want to. You're only going to be responsible for what's on the PowerPoint, but watch for that, and it's going to be called The Bridge. Hope you guys are doing well, and hope to see you again at some point. I don't know if it'll be this semester. I don't think it will be, but I do hope to see you again. Bye.